when a buyer's looking at it, they're always thinking about how is this business going to transfer? What's the transferability? And anything that could potentially impact transferability is going to come out in due diligence, and it's going to be, you either have to have a plan to mitigate around that.
From humble beginnings, Insurance Claim HQ has grown to one of the largest property casualty firms in the country. We didn't do it alone, and you shouldn't either. Every week, we're talking to claims professionals and top experts from all over, all to help you grow your business and make you stronger. Let's level up together. I'm Galen Hare. Welcome to the Level Up Claims Podcast. Many business owners in the trades and construction worlds are so busy keeping jobs moving that they never stop to ask, what's my company actually worth? And how do I protect that value? Today's guest, Jonathan Buehler, knows the answer. As the founder of Buehler Business Brokers, he helps contractors, HVAC, and home service entrepreneurs understand, grow, and ultimately sell their businesses for what they're truly worth. If you've ever wondered when or how to plan your exit, you'll find out why the right time might be sooner than you think. John, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Great. How are you?
I am hanging in there. We are headed into the holidays. Things are already getting bananas. It only took me an hour to get to work this morning in a normal 7-minute commute, but we're not going to let that bother us. So tell us, you had an early career. You did HVAC, you did distribution, you did manufacturing. So before we even get into brokerage, like what led you there? What do you think, what skill sets do you think made you go, aha, this is what I want to do?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I was actually looking to purchase my own company. I had friends and family that were in the air conditioning business, so I set out when I was in distribution, had a network of contractors I worked with and wanted to purchase one, and actually met a broker that I ended up working with for several years. And as we were looking at businesses together, he approached me and said, "Hey, I think that you've got great skills in sales and communications. I think you'd make a great broker. Um, what do you think about that?" And, after a little while, I thought about it, got my license, and we started working together and eventually did some deals. And I joined his firm full time in 2022, and the rest is history.
So first of all, kudos to you, because that is not an easy process, especially actually getting licensed. And something that's not on our list, I don't know if they even send you things that we might talk about to get you prepped, but something that's not on our list that I want to talk about is this world of like fly-by-night, unlicensed brokers. Because I had my first experience with one of them like 6 years ago, and I was just absolutely floored at how little regulation there is in some states. So some brokers can be so sketchy. So, what made you decide to do it the right way?
Yeah, so Florida's a licensed state. We're governed by real estate license here, so you have to have a real estate license to practice. And that kind of puts some guardrails around it. But there are a lot of non-licensed states, as you know, and the barrier to entry can be quite low. And business brokerage is one of those things that I think, just in recent years is starting to get more recognized profession. People are understanding what we do, especially with the whole, entrepreneur through acquisition. So there's a lot more education out there for buyers. So I think that people are really seeking out those professionals that really work in this space. But yeah, it's M&A is a very wide field. You have everything from selling small businesses all the way up to 100 million plus dollar deals. And so the type of people that you're going to meet can vary in skill set and abilities to handle that type of scope.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, right? So they're not all created equal. So what do you think? Like if I don't know, I'm in Louisiana. Let's say you're not here, or you have no desire to be here. If I said, John, I need a broker to help me sell my law firm, let's ignore the fact that there are tons of ethical issues with that. But if I could say that, and I did say that, what would you tell me to look for in a broker?
So there's some great national organizations. One's called the International Business Brokers Association, and they are really a advocate of professional ethics and standards in this industry. So that's the first thing I would look at is what brokers in your area are part of the International Business Brokers Association. And then from there, I think it really depends on, you know, there's become more and more of a trend in this industry where people are specializing in different types of things. So, for example, I work with home service contractors primarily, but there are some brokers out there that specialize in, selling pool routes or working with attorneys, for example. So, not saying that a generalist can't help you, but it just depends on what level of, specialty you're looking for. But definitely the IVBA is a great place to start.
That's awesome. All right, let's try to talk about selling and value and sale price. I think people so often are on one of two ends of the spectrum, and they are usually very far on the ends of the spectrum. Very few people are centrist on this. I run into people who either think their business is the best thing ever and it is worth so much more than I think reasonably, like I would ever consider buying it for. Or I meet people that have no clue what they have, no clue what they've really done, and they value their business almost nothing. I've got examples of both we're going to talk about today. Um, how do you, as a broker, as someone that actually goes out and finds people that are willing to pay a price, or has people that are willing to pay a price and finds people that are willing to sell? How should we truly be measuring the sale price of our company in the home service world, let's say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there are several different valuations approaches that people use. A very common one in our industry is a market approach, where we're evaluating the cash flow of the company and comparing you to other types of businesses that are in your same space. But beyond the numbers, there's a lot of things that go into evaluation of a business that don't necessarily show up on a profit and loss statement. For example, is the owner very involved in the business, and would it transfer well to a new buyer if the owner were to leave the business? So one of the questions we like to ask an owner is, "Hey, if you couldn't pick up the phone, send an email, or work for 3 months, what would happen to your business?" And that's a great litmus test for them to kind of figure out where the company is dependent on them or not, how well they're doing in that area. And there's several other things, but I think that, the financial valuation gives you a baseline, using one of the traditional approaches like a market approach. And then from there, digging a little deeper and trying to understand what are the things in this business that a buyer is going to want, such as less owner dependence, obviously financial performance. We can dive into some of those things, but it's not just in what's on the profit and loss statement.
Let's talk about some of those other things. I think those would be helpful because I know right now in the roofing world, there's this culture of I'm going to start a new company. I'm going to grow as fast as humanly possible. And in 3 to 5 years, I'm going to try to get out and sell for a multiplier and just wash, rinse, and repeat. But I have watched these deals go down, most of them private equity deals. And I don't think that they are playing out quite that way because I think that the buyer is looking for different factors. So, what are some of those factors that are not simply revenue and profit?
Yeah, I mean, some buyers, for example, that I've dealt with don't want to look at a business that's less than 8 or 10 years old. For example, they want to see some stability in the marketplace. That the owner's been around, they've established some goodwill amongst the customers. Another thing is the financial performance of the business. So, yes, you have the earnings. Of course, you need healthy earnings in a business, but what do the financial statements look like? Are they being job costed? Do you know exactly where your margins are at? Are you running a bunch of personal expenses through the business? So, really, that quality of financial is another level of risk that a buyer is evaluating, and it's one that I think a lot of owners don't spend a lot of time on. But if you think about it, when you sell your business, a lot of times they're not going to talk to your employees or your customers. They're going to view some sort of marketing information on your business, have a few conversations with you, and then make an offer, perhaps. And the financials are really what tell the story of the business. So if they're very clean, organized, and meticulous, then that gives them a much better idea of how the rest of the business is run. Um,
Mm.
there are other things too, like customer concentration. I had a customer not a few years ago. They had a business that did over $1 million in earnings. Great business. But when we dug a little deeper, we found out that two customers represented almost 50% of the revenue. So to a buyer, that
Yeah.
just represents this large risk, right? And concentration can be not just in customers either. It can be in your suppliers. It could be, are
Mm,
you dependent on certain key employee in the business to where if they were to leave, you would be in serious trouble. So identifying those risk areas when a buyer's looking at it, they're always thinking about how is this business going to transfer? What's the transferability? And anything that could potentially impact transferability is going to come out in due diligence, and it's going to be, you have to have a plan to mitigate around that.
mm, that makes sense. And again, that's something you probably don't think about, right? Suppliers is a great example. Having one supplier, well, that's great for me as a business because I only have to deal with one supplier. But what's the risk if that supplier doesn't deliver, or if they're actually producing goods is suddenly faulty, right? So I get it. It makes a lot of sense, but I don't think it's obvious. All right, let's do my two examples. Um, I want to kind of give you the examples and tell me kind of how you feel about their valuation, like what types of things you would want to consider if you were selling these businesses. Okay. So first one, law firm in Florida. Um, Profitability, revenue's there. Revenue's there. They had, millions of revenue a year. However, the vast majority of those funds going towards expenses to fund continued operations, as well as salaries for highly paid employees, including owner, 100% owner. Okay. Um, so no profitability. In fact, at the time I bring you the financials to buy the law firm in Florida, they have probably 2 months, 3 months maybe of operating capital left. Okay. So, however, owner states that his goodwill is enormous. He and let's assume arguendo that it's true. I think it could certainly be disputed, but he says his goodwill is enormous. He's a good marketing he's a great marketer. People trust him. They like him. So therefore, he believes his firm is worth $8 million. I don't know how he's calculating that. What things do you need to know to figure out what it's worth, and what concerns do you have, if any?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially you're saying the business doesn't it's not profitable?
Yeah, at this point, at least it's not profitable. They don't have enough money coming in to cover their operations. In about 3 months, they'll be in the red.
Yeah, yeah. Those are tough scenarios. And I see that from time to time where you've got a nice business, it's operating, it's got a lot of employees, there's a lot of revenue and things coming through it, but the earnings just aren't there. And really, that type of business is probably only going to be valuable to maybe like a strategic buyer, somebody who sees value in maybe they have their own cost already, like their own back office costs, and they can reduce some of those things off of the profit and loss statement. But that's really a tricky scenario as far as evaluating something like that because you can't use a necessarily a traditional valuation method. So that's really going to be dependent on the synergies of the buyer and where they think they can save. And then obviously, if the guy, it's probably still not going to be in the realm of $8 million, for example, because it's all about return on investment and what does it add in terms of value if you were to roll it into your business. Um, so I think that, you know, probably determining the synergistic strategies on that, but it's going to be really hard to reconcile that gap between what the owner wants and what somebody thinks it's worth. And in that case, a lot of businesses end up not selling, and therefore you know, they don't sell and they either continue to go as they are, or perhaps they revisit it down the road when they're a little bit more realistic.
Yeah, or go under ultimately, I guess, if they run out of money, right?
That happens too.
But what about this owner's contention that people love him, so he'll continue to bring in business, and he's got a great name. How do you approach that if you're advising a potential buyer?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you can good what we call that blue sky, right? I mean, it's hard to quantify what that value is. I mean, I'm sure there is some value, but for a large valuation, I would probably go back to that person and tell them this is what the firm actually needs to look like in terms of, the profitability and some of the other metrics that are important for me to give you that type of valuation for this business. Um,
Gotcha.
because otherwise, I don't think that you're going to, you know, you're going to be at an impasse there.
Gotcha.
And it's
Makes
not
sense.
uncommon for business owners to be very unrealistic. I mean, one of the questions I always ask when I'm doing evaluation is, I go through my questions. We're determining risk. We're looking at earnings. One of the last questions I ask is, what would it take for you to want to sell this business? And for example, I had a company not too long ago. They were doing about, I don't know, $2.5 million in revenue. It was a smaller company. Nice. Had been around for a long time. And they said, we wouldn't consider anything less than $8 million for it. Um, in reality, the company was probably worth around 1 million. So, I mean, that kind of just puts a full stop on the conversation right there. And I just say, hey, listen, I think you've got a great business. I don't, you put a lot of sweat equity into this. I don't want to insult you, but we are nowhere near that valuation. If you want to get there, I can show you what it would take in terms of revenue, earnings, and you could probably put a plan together to get there eventually. But that is just not the market won't be able to pay you that.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And so if you're kind of advising, let's say, the seller now in that same example, what I mean, it sounds like you're telling him, well, A, get profitable, right? Try to clean up, reduce costs, increase income. That way your books look better. I'm sure that's part one, right?
Sure.
But part two, are you advising him to kind of change his marketing strategy so it's not so centric around him in order to increase the value of the business? Because otherwise, it sounds like the value of that blue sky, goodwill is really just in that person. And if that person leaves, the value disappears.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a problem. There are some creative things that if the owner was willing to stay on for a long period of time and help transition the business. But what we find typically is that, the owner doesn't want to stay on for a long period of time, especially if they're near retirement age. And that's why, I always tell people start that process earlier because the worst thing is when somebody comes to me and they say, hey, I'm ready to sell my business. I just bought the RV. Um, I turned 68, 65 next year. I'm all set. And then you tell them that their business is worth half or less than half of what they think it is. It's really disheartening for them because in order to make process improvements and increase value on a business, it's not like a home where you can just go in and, you know, put a new bathrooms and floors and renovate in a couple months. Businesses take time to correct issues, especially things like customer concentration and owner dependency. Those are not necessarily quick fixes. So the sooner you start working on those items, the better position you're going to be down the road when you do want to have that conversation.
No, that makes perfect sense. All right, let's do example two because it's the opposite. Let's say we got an HVAC company, okay? Been around forever, decades. Small held company, owner plus maybe a couple of employees. Been doing it but he's been doing it his whole life. Um, Knows the stuff like the back of his hand. His business is commercial and residential. All right. So he believe how commercial though, he's got like a handful of just really, really big clients. It's not volume commercial, right? It's like, let's say it's like the zoo and, the biggest park in town and things like that, right? So big commercial clients. Um, so not a tiny, maybe tiny in size, but not tiny in revenue. Um, he thinks his business is worth nothing. So his plan, let's say, is to essentially give the residential side of the business to a closely held employee and let the rest of it go. What would you tell him as far as obviously you don't have numbers, so you can't value it, but what would you tell him about things that you would be interested in finding to figure out what value is there? Or do you agree with his plan? Do you think he's right? His business is worth pretty much nothing, so he should just walk away.
Well, I don't think you can ever determine if the business is worth nothing until you've had it valued by somebody. Um, but I do hear that some from time to time where people don't realize that their business may have value and they decide to shut it down. In terms of what I would ask for, um, you know, the same types of things that we've been talking about. Obviously the financial statements, understanding what the profitability of the business looks like, and things like HVAC. A lot of the revenue mix is um, can determine value of the business. For example, on the residential side, do they have recurring revenue? Do they have maintenance contracts? Um, what percentage of the business is residential versus commercial, how much service, just basically analyzing it and then determining from there, what the best course of action is. Sometimes it is to sell it to an employee. I wouldn't necessarily say give it to an employee, but even if you couldn't get traditional bank financing, for, say it had issues, you could always, if you trusted the employee, work out a deal where you held a note for them and they paid you over time or something like that. But try to get some value for it. Um, Also, I think that understand what the employee base looks like, where the risks are, the same things that we would do in evaluation, because there's going to be a discount because you're not taking it out to market. You're going to sell it to an employee, for example. But if it does have marketability, you should know that, right? And if you can, if let's say that it is in a position where you could get bank financing on it, well, then you can work with your employee, go to work with an SBA lender, and you could probably get most of your money up front, with an
Mm.
SBA loan and not have to hold a large loan or, give it away. So I think that just understanding what your options are and working with someone who can advise you is important. Um, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does, and it sounds like, I think that's the point is I think there's a lot of people in the home service world that assume, even though they're not the ones marketing, they're not the ones on the TV because there might not even be TV or radio or whatever, they assume the whole value is them, so there is no value to their company, right? But there very much is because they do have a customer base, and if they've been around for a couple of decades, you've got a loyal customer base, right? They might like seeing Mr. So and so show up, but they've accepted those other employees coming from time to time too. So they're not likely to bail. They're likely to keep calling that phone
Yeah,
number,
yeah.
you know?
And I mean, I also some companies will kind of wind down. I've seen where a home service center will kind of wind down the business a little bit. But even just in your customer database and your files and things like that, there's value in that to certain people. So I think it's always worth taking a look at.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And I think that's such a big factor as well as like people just don't know how to even approach it. And it sounds like that's one of the reasons to even consult with a business broker is to start getting that information and figuring out what it might be worth on the market, right?
Yeah, I mean, I always think that if we have a saying, know the value of your business. Where does it sit today? Identify any risk in the business that could potentially hurt your value, and you can address that through different types of measures out there, including insurance. And then from there, you can decide, do I want to grow this and increase value, or do I want to sell and go ahead and take my chips off the table? But at least at that point, you're making an informed decision. I mean, it's interesting. We all watch our 401ks and keep track of our home equity, but a lot of times a business can be the most valuable thing that a person owns. Statistically, up to 70% of somebody's wealth can be in the value of their business, but it's not something that people are treating the same way as far as an asset class to their personal wealth,
Yeah.
you know?
No, that makes
So
sense. And go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if you start looking at it like an asset, it can sometimes create a mindset shift where it's like, okay, this is not just a job, this is an asset, and I need to protect this asset, grow it, and make it transferable. And that's really the key right there, transferable. Getting it, to unlock the value of a business, it has to be transferable. Because if you're the
Mm.
only one who can run it and you're the only one who knows how to, make it work, then it's not gonna have value to other people. The most valuable businesses out there are the ones that are transferable to buyers once the owner is gone.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right. Kind of almost getting towards the end, but I do have another topic I want to cover, which is like really planning the exit. So what do great owners do before they think about selling?
Yeah, as well, I start with evaluation and determining what the business is. Where do you sit today, right? And then from there, taking an assessment on some of these value drivers that we've been talking about. How dependent is the business on the owner? Do you have customer, supplier, key employee concentration risk? Do you have systems and processes that make your business scalable, right? Um, as far as your marketing and things like that, or do you just rely on word of mouth? How are your customer reviews out there? All those things that really affect the transferability of a business. as you improve those things, the transferability is also going to increase, which is going to increase your valuation. So I always tell people, go ahead and run your business like you want to sell it, like you're building it to sell, because one day you're going to transfer it, either voluntary or involuntarily. And then from there, you have a lot of options on what it is you want to do, because life happens sometimes too, right? Where, an illness strikes, a divorce or something like that. And those are sometimes the hardest situations to have conversations around because, when a business starts to go decline in revenue, it basically the value evaporates rapidly, and it can become a worthless asset very, very fast. So, for example, I've had a couple conversations recently where owners had passed away unexpectedly, and the kids took the business, and tried to run it, and within a year, the business basically, had lost all of its value. So exit planning, people I think get afraid of that word exit, right? But it's really just good business strategy. And the other side of exit planning, and I think where people sometimes avoid, hey, what's my life going to look like after I'm done with this business, right? Because
Mm,
their identity's in their business, it's what they do. They don't even want to think about what it's going to look like after that. And that's where I think evaluating your life on the personal side, and understanding what is it that I want to do with my life after this business? What is it that intrinsically is going to motivate me to want to continue? Do I have hobbies and activities that I want to do? Um, have I talked with my financial advisor, and do I know how much money I need to sell this business for me to be comfortable? So there's a personal side and a business side. And I think that the sooner you can start that process and make those paths diverge at some point, you'll know when it's time. And then if you put the work in, you're going to have a great outcome.
yeah, I could not agree more. So, kind of, this is going to be a hard question to answer, but I want you to try anyway because I know people are sitting at home wondering this, and I know you're going to be so tempted to say it depends. Just do your best. Um, how do I
The
know
attorney
when?
answer.
Yeah, right. I know, but I know people are wondering because, yeah, you can't predict the divorce, the death. You can't predict those things. Fair, right? So let's push those out. But how do I know when I should be trying to exit?
Again, I think that it goes back to that personal readiness to exit, right? When can be a part of that you can answer with a financial piece, right? If I were to quit working from this business, what kind of income do I need to maintain my lifestyle, and what does that look like? And working with your financial advisor, if you do have a liquidity event on a large asset like a business, he's going to be able to tell you, well, after taxes and all the things, this is the principal that's left. Is that enough for me to invest in my, portfolio and draw income? So there's a financial piece to it. And then I think there's the mental aspect of it, right? Which is some people are just terrified to think of what it's going to be like when they don't run that business anymore, because they've, you know, for years they've been in their communities, they're leading teams, they're doing things. And I think that sometimes when your worth is associated with your business, like that's where you kind of put your identity, it can be really hard to, you know, want to have that conversation. So I think that understanding and working with someone who can actually help you see past that, because, you know, my pastor says the death rate in America is hovering right around 100%, right? So we're either going to go out voluntarily or involuntarily. So I think just
Yeah.
trying to understand what your life is going to look like after that business. So, and timing and things like that definitely can matter, you know, but I'll tell you this, we've had a great market the last few years, and there's people out there where I've looked at their business and I'm like, man, you should sell this business. Right now is a great time to sell it. It makes sense. You can get the most amount of money. But until somebody is really, truly ready to let go of that business, sometimes I think price can, it's not enough to move the needle necessarily.
Fair, fair. All right. Last but certainly not least, John, what does it mean to you to level up?
Yeah, I think for me to level up, it's to help 1,000 business owners protect their most valuable asset, which is their business.
I love that. John, thank you so much for joining. You've been so great with your time, and we really appreciate you.
Thanks, Galen. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
I'd like to thank Jonathan Buehler for joining us on the podcast. As you can see, whether to sell your business, when to sell your business, how to sell your business is full of a lot of different questions. Some of these questions may never be answered. There's probably not a correct answer. But for you, you have to make sure your business is sustainable without you, and you have to make sure that you are ready to actually let go. Follow us on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player, and make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date on our latest podcasts.